Emma's fingers tightened around her tablet, her pulse hammering in her ears as she squared her shoulders. "Sir, I need you to move to economy." Daniel Brooks looked up at her, calm, composed. He didn't argue. He didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a single tap, he sent a message. Emma frowned. "Sir, I—" Before she could finish, the intercom crackled to life. "Flight Attendant Carter, report to the cockpit immediately." A ripple of murmurs spread through the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably. Emma swallowed hard, her confidence faltering for the first time. As she turned toward the cockpit, she couldn't help but glance back at Daniel. He was still watching her, still calm, and then he smiled. Not smugly, not arrogantly, just knowingly, and suddenly Emma felt very, very cold. But before we dive deeper into the story, tell me, where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments, and if you love stories about justice and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Prestige Airways prided itself on being an airline for the elite, a symbol of exclusivity in the skies. From the moment passengers stepped into the private first-class lounge at LAX, they were immersed in an experience designed for luxury. Champagne flutes clinked against polished marble tables, the soft hum of classical music played beneath the murmur of conversations between CEOs, celebrities, and high-profile travelers. Every detail, from the scent of fresh orchids to the pristine leather seats, was curated to cater to those who expected nothing less than perfection. It was an atmosphere of quiet indulgence where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was assumed. In the terminal, the energy of Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Business executives in tailored suits strode purposefully through the concourse, their phone calls blending into the background noise of last-minute boarding announcements. Paparazzi hovered outside the VIP lounge, hoping for a glimpse of a high-profile actor or tech mogul heading to New York. Meanwhile, travelers in economy, weighed down by overstuffed carry-ons and restless children, cast envious glances toward the sleek, glass-enclosed gateway leading to first class. This was the world of Prestige Airways, a world where access was everything, and Emma Carter thrived on enforcing that unspoken rule. Emma had worked for Prestige Airways for nearly a decade, climbing her way up from junior crew member to senior flight attendant, a position that commanded respect and authority. She wasn't just good at her job, she was one of the best. Her uniform, pressed to perfection, bore a gold nameplate that gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights. Her posture was immaculate, her blonde hair twisted into a flawless bun, and her sharp blue eyes scanned the boarding passengers with the precision of someone who had seen it all. She had dealt with entitled travelers, irate businessmen, and panicked first-time flyers, and she had mastered the delicate balance of charm and control that kept first class running smoothly. But above all else, she prided herself on maintaining order. First class wasn't just a seat, it was a privilege, and she made sure it stayed that way. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, mentally checking her pre-flight list, her gaze landed on a man seated in 2A. Something about him made her pause. He was well-dressed but understated, wearing a crisp navy suit that fit him effortlessly, the kind that spoke of quiet wealth rather than ostentatious display. His shoes were polished but practical, his wristwatch sleek but unassuming. He sat with an air of quiet confidence, legs crossed, fingers tapping absently on the armrest, exuding a presence that somehow felt both at ease and in control. And yet, something about him didn't quite fit. Emma had developed an instinct over the years, a sixth sense for spotting passengers who didn't belong. It wasn't just about attire, it was about attitude. First-class passengers carried themselves a certain way. They expected to be there. They exuded entitlement, either through subtle arrogance or effortless familiarity. But this man, he was too calm, too collected. There was no tension, no insecurity, no flicker of acknowledgement that he was indulging in something special that unsettled her. She glanced at the name on her tablet and frowned. Daniel Brooks. The name wasn't familiar. He wasn't a regular VIP, No celebrity, no Fortune 500 CEO she could recall. There were no red flag indicators of an upgrade mix-up, yet something in her gut told her there was a mistake. A quiet hum of curiosity stirred among the other first-class passengers, subtle but present. A woman in pearl earrings stole a quick glance at him before returning to her magazine. A man in the opposite row shifted slightly, as if registering the same unspoken question that Emma was now fixated on. Did he really belong here? Tightening her grip on her tablet, Emma took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped toward him. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong seat." Emma's voice was steady, professional, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. She had delivered this line countless times before, to confused travelers who had mistakenly wandered into first class, to hopeful passengers trying to talk their way into an upgrade, to those who simply didn't belong. She expected the usual response, surprise, maybe mild embarrassment, followed by a quick shuffle of belongings as they retreated to their proper section. But the man in 2A didn't react the way she anticipated. He didn't fumble for an excuse, didn't glance around in confusion, didn't even show a flicker of irritation. Instead, he looked up at her, expression unreadable, and held her gaze for just a moment longer than she was comfortable with before reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, exuding the same quiet confidence that had unsettled her in the first place. He pulled out a neatly folded boarding pass and handed it to her without a word. Emma took the slip of paper and flicked her eyes over it briefly, just enough to confirm the name, Daniel Brooks, and the seat assignment, 2A. She barely registered the details before handing it back, already certain that some kind of mistake had been made. This wasn't about a printing error or a clerical mishap. This was about instinct, about experience, about knowing at a glance who belonged and who didn't. And everything in her told her that this man didn't. "I need you to move to economy," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. She had dealt with enough passengers trying to talk their way into first class to recognize when someone was stalling, but Daniel wasn't arguing. He wasn't pleading his case. He wasn't even questioning her. He simply accepted the boarding pass back, folded it neatly, and slid it back into his pocket, his movements measured, unhurried. Then, instead of responding to her request, he did something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. He smiled. It wasn't the smug, defiant grin of someone who had been caught trying to cheat the system. It wasn't the forced, uncomfortable smile of a person realizing they had made a mistake. It was calm, effortless, the kind of smile that wasn't about amusement or appeasement, but something deeper, something unnerving. It was the smile of a man who knew something she didn't. A murmur spread through the first-class cabin as passengers picked up on the exchange. Some stole curious glances, pretending to remain engrossed in their tablets or newspapers while keeping their ears tuned to the unfolding scene. Others made no effort to hide their interest, turning slightly in their seats to watch. Emma could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her, could hear the soft whispers of speculation starting to spread like a ripple through the cabin. Still, Daniel said nothing. He didn't reach for his belongings, didn't shift in his seat, didn't make any move to comply. He simply sat there, relaxed, watching her. Wait. A low chuckle broke through the murmurs. Ethan Wallace, seated across the aisle in 2B, leaned forward with an amused smirk, the kind of expression that belonged to a man who had spent his entire life certain of his place in the world. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with precision, his expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights as he adjusted his cufflinks with an air of practiced ease. He had been watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement, waiting for the perfect moment to insert himself into the conversation. Now he had it. "Sweetheart, I don't blame you for the mistake," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the rows behind him. "Some people just don't belong here." Emma didn't respond right away, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward, just slightly, as if she found the remark funny. She didn't agree aloud, but she didn't correct him either. It wasn't necessary. The moment hung in the air, charged with an unspoken understanding between them. Ethan had voiced the thoughts she hadn't said out loud, had validated the instinct that had driven her to challenge Daniel in the first place. Across the aisle, a woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, glanced toward Daniel, then back at Ethan, his expression tense but unreadable. Other passengers avoided looking altogether, suddenly very interested in their in-flight magazines and digital screens. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was complicit. Daniel, however, remained unmoved. His posture didn't shift, his breathing didn't change, and that quiet, knowing smile never faltered. If Ethan's words had any effect on him, he gave no indication. Instead, he reached for his wrist, checking his watch with the same casual air as a man waiting for his coffee order at a cafe. A slow, deliberate movement, but precise. Timed. Then, without a word, he pulled his phone from his pocket, unlocked it with a quick tap, and sent a short message. One text. Nothing dramatic, no raised voice, no protest. He placed the phone back into his lap, folded his hands, and leaned back in his seat as if he had all the time in the world. Emma frowned. Something about his composure unsettled her. She had dealt with passengers who got aggressive, others who threw tantrums, and a handful who tried to charm their way into first class, but she had never encountered someone like this, someone who wasn't reacting the way they were supposed to. Passengers continued watching, waiting for the next move, expecting either an argument or reluctant compliance. But Daniel gave them neither. He simply sat there, calm, unbothered, as if he already knew exactly how this would play out. And somehow that was more unnerving than if he had fought back. A voice cut through the tense silence, clear and firm. "Why are you still asking him to move? He gave you his ticket." All eyes turned toward the speaker, a black woman seated a few rows ahead. She looked to be in her mid-40s, elegant in a tailored navy blazer, her gold earrings catching the overhead light as she angled her body toward Emma. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a challenge laced with disbelief. She had been watching from the start, her expression unreadable, but now the irritation in her voice was impossible to miss. Emma felt her face heat, her grip tightening around her tablet. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut in. "She's just doing her job." This time, the speaker was a white woman in the row behind Ethan Wallace. She crossed her arms, shaking her head slightly as she looked at the black woman. "If he doesn't belong, he needs to go. People try to sneak into first class all the time." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers glanced at each other, unsure of which side to take, while others remained silent, waiting to see how things would unfold. A man in his 30s, wearing glasses and a gray blazer, cleared his throat but said nothing. The younger man from earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension was no longer just about Emma and Daniel. It was seeping into every corner of the first-class cabin, forcing people to take notice, to form opinion. Emma's pulse quickened. This was spiraling faster than she had expected. She had assumed this would be routine, a minor correction, a momentary inconvenience for a man who would eventually move without issue. But now the air in the cabin had changed. The whispers had turned into quiet arguments, passengers exchanging wary glances, some openly taking sides, and through it all, Daniel remained exactly as he had been, calm, unmoved, waiting. Emma's stomach twisted. Something about his stillness made her uneasy. There was no resistance, no frustration, no demand for fairness. He wasn't pleading his case, he wasn't even explaining himself. And that scared her more than if he had fought back. Her pride burned at the edges of her nerves. She had been in this job too long to let a passenger dictate how things ran. She knew the rules, and she enforced them. She had worked hard to earn respect in this airline, and she wasn't about to let that slip away over one passenger who refused to comply. Forcing herself to breathe evenly, she straightened her posture and reached for the in-flight phone mounted on the bulkhead. The weight of the cabin's silence pressed against her shoulders as she lifted the receiver, her fingers moving automatically as she punched in the call to the cockpit. "Captain Reynolds, this is Carter," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I need security to meet us at the gate. We have a passenger refusing to move." The intercom crackled to life, slicing through the tense atmosphere like a blade. "Flight Attendant Carter, report to the cockpit immediately." Emma's breath caught. The voice wasn't routine. It wasn't the usual calm professionalism of the captain calling for a status update or a minor procedural check. It was sharp, clipped, urgent in a way that sent a ripple of unease through her chest. Her fingers, still gripping the in-flight phone, suddenly felt cold. For a split second she hesitated, standing frozen in place, her mind racing to piece together what this meant. The timing was too perfect, too immediate after her call for security. This wasn't standard protocol. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, their previous whispering now turning into something different. Curiosity, apprehension. Even Ethan Wallace, who had been smirking just moments ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The black woman who had spoken earlier leaned back, arms crossed, watching intently. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man glanced toward the cockpit door, brow furrowed in confusion. Emma forced herself to move. With stiff, measured steps, she made her way toward the front of the plane, her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. Every instinct told her something was off, that she had just stepped into something far beyond a simple seating dispute. As she passed Daniel's seat, she couldn't help but glance at him. He was still sitting exactly as he had been, calm, composed, completely unaffected. But this time, as she walked by, he met her gaze and held it. Not with arrogance, not with defiance, but with something worse. Knowing. Her stomach twisted. The whispers behind her grew louder, but she forced them out of her mind as she reached the cockpit door. Taking a steadying breath, she knocked twice before opening it and stepping inside. Captain James Reynolds was standing with his back to her, one hand gripping the armrest of his chair, his posture tense. The overhead panel cast harsh light across the small space, illuminating his face as he turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with something that sent a spike of unease down her spine. In front of him, mounted on the control panel, a small screen flickered with a live video call. The face on the screen belonged to someone Emma had only seen a handful of times, but knew carried more authority than anyone else on this plane. The voice that followed was calm but heavy, like a storm rolling in. "Did you just attempt to remove a first-class passenger from his seat?" Emma swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling over her like a lead blanket. "Yes," she said automatically, straightening her shoulders. He didn't belong there. A beat of silence stretched unbearably long. Then the voice on the screen delivered the words that made the floor feel like it had dropped out from beneath her. "You just tried to remove Daniel Brooks, the CEO and majority owner of Prestige Airways." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped fully into the cockpit, her grip tightening around the edge of the door. She had expected Captain Reynolds to greet her with a look of reassurance, maybe a nod of approval for handling a difficult passenger. Instead, the atmosphere in the small, dimly lit space was thick with something entirely different. Something heavy, something wrong. Captain Reynolds wasn't seated. He stood rigidly beside his chair, one hand braced against the console, his jaw set in a hard line. The glow from the control panels cast deep shadows over his face, accentuating the sharp tension in his features. Emma had worked with him for years, had seen him handle emergencies with unshakable calm. But now there was something cold in his stare, something distant. Then she saw the screen. Mounted above the instrument panel, the small monitor displayed a live video call. The face on the screen belonged to someone she recognized instantly. Richard Langston, Senior Vice President of Corporate Operations for Prestige Airways. She had only seen him in company-wide memos and leadership briefings, but his reputation preceded him. He was the kind of man who didn't waste words, didn't tolerate mistakes, and, most importantly, didn't get involved in mid-flight disputes unless something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. "Did you just attempt to remove a first-class passenger from his seat?" Langston's voice was controlled, deliberate, the kind of tone that made it clear he already knew the answer. Emma straightened, willing herself to maintain composure. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice professional. "He didn't belong there." Captain Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose. It wasn't quite a sigh, not quite a scoff, but somewhere in between, as if he already knew what was coming next and wanted no part of it. Langston didn't blink. His gaze stayed locked on her, unwavering. Then he spoke again, his next words landing like a hammer to her chest. "You just tried to remove Daniel Brooks, the CEO and majority owner of Prestige Airways." Emma felt her breath hitch, the blood draining from her face so fast she almost swayed on her feet. The words didn't make sense at first, like static in her brain refusing to clear. CEO? Majority owner? No, that wasn't possible. That man, he had been too normal, too quiet, too at ease. He hadn't acted like a man who ran an airline. He hadn't... A memory flashed, unbidden. The way he had looked at her when she insisted he move. Not surprised, not indignant, just patient, waiting. The floor beneath her felt suddenly unsteady. She opened her mouth, grasping for some kind of response, some kind of explanation that might make this moment less disastrous than it already was. But there was nothing. Only the weight of her own mistake pressing down on her like a crushing tide. Emma's breath came shallow and sharp, her body rigid as the words sank in. The CO, the majority owner, the man she had just tried to throw out of first class. It wasn't possible. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the way Captain Reynolds stood, arms crossed, eyes dark with quiet disappointment, told her it wasn't. Silence filled the cockpit, thick and suffocating. Langston's face remained impassive on the screen, his stare cold and calculating. He was waiting for her reaction, waiting to see if she had the intelligence to understand the gravity of what she had just done. Emma forced her lips to part, though her voice felt foreign to her own ears. "That can't be right," she said, shaking her head slightly as if she could will the truth away. I checked his ticket. I followed protocol. You followed protocol?" Langston cut in, his voice like ice. "Tell me, Miss Carter, did you check the passenger manifest before confronting him? Did you verify his identity before you attempted to humiliate him in front of the entire first-class cabin? Or did you simply decide, based on how he looked, that he didn't belong there?" The final question landed like a punch to the gut. Emma's mouth snapped shut, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She had no answer, because the truth, the undeniable, ugly truth, was that she had made a judgment before she even saw his ticket. She had barely glanced at it before handing it back. And when he had refused to move, she hadn't questioned herself, hadn't considered that she might be wrong. She had assumed. Her stomach twisted violently, the moment replayed in her mind, now in brutal clarity. Daniel Brooks sitting there, calm and composed, watching her as she dug her own grave. The passengers whispering, sensing something wasn't right. The black woman speaking up, questioning why she was still insisting he move. The way Daniel had never once argued, never once demanded justice. Because he had known. He had known exactly what she was doing, and he had simply waited for the moment the truth would reveal itself. Emma swallowed against the nausea rising in her throat. She started again, but the words wouldn't come. Langston exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You didn't just make a mistake, Carter. You made a decision. You looked at a man in first class and decided he didn't belong there. You chose to escalate a situation that never should have existed." His voice darkened, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. "And now, you've embarrassed this airline, you've embarrassed yourself, and most importantly, you've insulted the one man in this company who could end your career with a single phone call." The weight of his words crushed her, suffocating and absolute. Emma had prided herself on control, on knowing how to handle any situation, but this was spiraling into something she had no power over. She had spent her entire career enforcing the rules, ensuring order. Now, for the first time, she realized, she had never truly questioned whether those rules had been fair. Her fingers trembled at her sides. "I didn't mean..." Langston's expression didn't soften. "Intentions don't matter," he said flatly. "Perception does. And right now the perception is that one of our senior flight attendants singled out the CEO of this airline, assumed he didn't belong, and tried to remove him from his own seat. That's what the passengers saw. That's what they'll remember. That's what they'll talk about." He let that sink in before adding, "And if you think for a second this won't be public before the plane even lands, you're delusional." Emma felt like she was going to be sick. Her knees wobbled, but she locked them in place, refusing to show weakness. Every part of her screamed to defend herself, to argue that she wasn't like that she hadn't meant anything by it, that it had just been a misunderstanding. But what excuse could she possibly give? That she had a feeling that something about him hadn't seemed right? She knew exactly how that would sound. Captain Reynolds finally spoke, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like pity. "We have to handle this carefully, Langston." The executive on the screen nodded. "I agree. That's why I'm going to give her one last chance to explain herself. Not to me, not to the board, to him." He let that settle before continuing. "You will walk back into that cabin, and you will personally apologize to Daniel Brooks. Not just a quick, polite excuse, but a full acknowledgement of what you did, and then you will escort him back to his seat." Emma's entire body stiffened. Apologize? Publicly? Humiliate herself in front of every passenger? Her stomach churned violently. Langston's tone dropped, final and absolute. "Or you can sit here and wait for security to meet you at the gate. Your choice." Emma knew then, without a doubt, that she had already lost. Emma's mouth opened, but the words refused to come. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, for some way to justify what had just happened. But every excuse she reached for crumbled before she could even form it into a sentence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an error in seating arrangements. She had made a judgment, a choice, without thinking twice. And now she was standing here face to face with the consequences. "I didn't know," she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought." "You thought." Langston's voice sliced through her weak attempt at an explanation, as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "That's exactly the problem, Carter. You didn't know, and yet you acted with absolute certainty. You didn't ask. You didn't check. You just decided." He exhaled, slow and controlled, his expression giving away nothing. "We will discuss your employment status upon landing." Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. Employment status, that was corporate talk for, "You're done here." A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. This couldn't be happening. She had given a decade of her life to this airline. She had worked harder, been stricter, demanded excellence in a way that few others could match. She was the one who enforced the rules, not the one who broke them. But none of that mattered now. She turned toward Captain Reynolds, silently pleading for some kind of support, some reassurance that this could be salvaged, that someone, anyone, would step in and say that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But as soon as she met his gaze, her stomach dropped. There was no sympathy in his eyes, no understanding, no hesitation, just cold disappointment. He didn't say anything right away, and somehow that was worse than if he had yelled. She had worked with Reynolds for years. He was a steady leader, unshakable in crisis, a man who carried himself with quiet authority. She had always respected him, admired him even, for his ability to remain calm under pressure. But now, standing before him, she realized something horrifying. She had lost his respect. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe he was even having this conversation. "You should have known better, Carter," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You're supposed to be one of the best." Emma felt her throat tighten. The words stung in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent years building her reputation, commanding authority, ensuring that people listened when she spoke. But now, in this moment, she felt smaller than she ever had before. And worse, she realized she was completely alone in this. No one was going to step in to save her. No one was going to soften the blow. She had made this mess. And now she was the only one who would have to clean it up. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the cockpit door, her fingers numb against the handle. The moment she stepped out, the weight of the cabin's silence hit her like a wall. The air felt heavier, charged with quiet judgment. Every step back toward first class felt like walking into an execution. Her usually confident stride faltered as she moved down the aisle. The passengers weren't pretending to ignore her anymore. They weren't just stealing glances. They were watching, some openly, others from the corners of their eyes, but all with the same expression: recognition, understanding, realization. The whispers had changed. Before, they had been murmurs of curiosity, speculation about whether or not Daniel Brooks belonged. Now they knew the truth. Now the hushed voices weren't questioning him, they were questioning her. A businessman in his 40s adjusted his tie and turned away as she passed, suddenly fascinated by his untouched drink. A younger woman scrolled on her phone, her brows furrowing as if she was already typing out a message about what had just happened. And then there was Ethan Wallace. The smugness he had worn just minutes ago had vanished. His fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. His eyes locked on the window as if the view outside had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. Because now, there was no joke to be made. Emma swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. The first-class section had always been her domain. She was the one who controlled it, the one who set the rules, the one who made sure everything ran exactly as it should. But now, for the first time in her career, she didn't feel like she belonged here. She stopped beside Daniel's seat. He was still sitting there, still composed, still watching, but this time there was something different in his gaze, something patient, something knowing. Now, he didn't look triumphant, he didn't look smug. He just looked like a man who had seen this all before. Emma's fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform, steadying herself. She opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to say. Emma took a slow, shaky breath, willing herself to regain control, but it was useless. Every part of her, her hands, her voice, even the air in her lungs, betrayed her. She was trembling, her pulse pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out the murmur of the cabin. She forced herself to stand straight, to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. Daniel Brooks sat still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the beginning. Calm, unbothered, a man who had been here before, a man who had expected this moment. Emma's mouth was dry as she forced the words out. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding." It was weak, barely above a whisper, and as soon as she said it, she knew it wasn't enough. The words felt hollow, empty, and completely insufficient for the moment. She had delivered 1,000 apologies in her career, polite, controlled, rehearsed, but none of them had ever felt like this. The passengers weren't fooled. She could feel them shifting, exchanging glances, silently questioning whether that was all she had to offer. The tension in the cabin didn't break. If anything, it thickened. Daniel raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. His expression didn't change, but his silence spoke louder than if he had called her out in front of everyone. He was waiting, not for a weak corporate-approved apology, not for an excuse, for the truth. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She forced herself to look at him, really look at him, and in that moment the reality of what she had done came crashing down. She had humiliated a man in front of a full cabin of people. She had assumed he didn't belong here, and she had acted on that assumption with absolute authority. And now she was standing here, forced to face it in front of everyone. Her lips parted again, but this time the words tasted bitter. She hesitated, her voice still shaking. "I was wrong." A murmur spread through the passengers. Even Ethan Wallace, who had been staring at the window like it held the secret to his escape, finally turned his head slightly. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't let her off the hook. Emma's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She had never felt this exposed before, this small. She took another breath, forced the words out before she could stop herself. "I assumed something about you that I shouldn't have, and I treated you unfairly." Daniel finally blinked, exhaling slowly as he studied her, as if assessing whether she really meant it. The silence that followed was suffocating. The entire first-class cabin held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Daniel leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression still unreadable, but now there was something else in his eyes. Amusement? No, not quite. It was sharper than that, more controlled. He exhaled slowly, then let a small smirk play at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to look around to know that every passenger in first class was watching, hanging on to this moment, waiting to see how it would unfold. He had been here before. He had seen this play out in different ways, in different places, with different people, and now, as always, he had a choice: let it go or make it a lesson. He chose the latter. Misunderstanding, he said, his voice calm, steady, or assumption. The words sliced through the air like a scalpel. The cabin, which had been filled with quiet murmurs just moments ago, fell completely silent. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Emma felt it pressing against her ribs, wrapping around her throat like a vice. She had expected him to accept her apology, to nod and let it be over. But that wasn't happening. He wasn't letting her walk away from this with a carefully rehearsed excuse. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't know how to answer. Daniel tilted his head, studying her, giving her a chance to speak, to defend herself, to offer something, anything, that wasn't just corporate politeness. But she had nothing. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he continued, his tone still light, still composed. "Just me." A flicker of movement caught her attention. A passenger shifting uncomfortably in their seat, someone clearing their throat, the quiet, guilty realization spreading through the cabin that they, too, had just accepted what she did without question. Emma's stomach churned. She knew he was right. She had walked through this cabin 1,000 times, had checked 100 first-class passengers, and yet today, she had singled him out. Not because of his behavior, not because he looked suspicious or nervous or out of place in the way scammers usually did. No, she had done it because something about him hadn't fit into the picture of what she had decided first class should look like. And she had acted on that instinct without hesitation. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her mouth dry. I wasn't thinking." Daniel let out a quiet, almost amused breath through his nose. "No," he agreed, nodding slightly. "You weren't." That was the moment she realized the full weight of what she had done. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just a bad call, an embarrassing moment, a lapse in judgment. This was something bigger. Because if Daniel Brooks hadn't been the CEO, if he hadn't had the power to expose what had just happened, she would never have been forced to recognize it at all. Emma felt her throat tighten, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. She wanted to say something, anything, to make this moment feel less damning, less suffocating, but there was no way out. She knew it. Daniel knew it. And now, so did everyone else. She had spent years mastering the art of control, of ensuring that order was maintained in her cabin. But now, standing here, exposed in front of a silent, watching crowd, she realized she had lost all control. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to look angry or offended. His words had already done the damage, and worst of all, he wasn't wrong. Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. But the words stuck, refusing to come. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling as if he had already known this would happen. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he repeated, his voice steady, not cruel, not mocking, just factual. "Just me." Emma felt something crack inside her, something raw and ugly and impossible to ignore. The truth sat between them like a storm cloud, heavy, unshakable. She could deny it, but what would be the point? She could argue, but no one would believe her, because she didn't believe herself. A shifting noise broke through the silence. Somewhere in the cabin, a passenger adjusted in their seat, the sound barely audible over the tension pressing down on all of them. And then, slowly, the ripple of realization began to spread. A woman near the front, who had been absorbed in her magazine earlier, lowered it slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. The man who had defended Emma before, the one who had said she was just doing her job, suddenly avoided eye contact with everyone. Even Ethan Wallace, who had been so confident, so smug just moments ago, had gone completely still. His jaw clenched as he stared blankly ahead, refusing to meet Daniel's gaze. No one spoke. No one tried to defend her now. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with their watches, adjusting their seatbelts, pretending they weren't a part of this. Others just looked away entirely, embarrassed for her, maybe even embarrassed for themselves. Because deep down, some of them knew they wouldn't have questioned it either. Emma's breathing was shallow, her hands stiff at her sides. The power she had once wielded with such confidence, the authority she had relied on, was gone. In its place was only the weight of her own actions. And Daniel just sat there, watching her, waiting. Emma's entire body felt numb, her breath shallow, her throat tight as she stood there, paralyzed by the weight of what had just unfolded. The cabin remained eerily silent, the energy thick with unspoken truths, with the kind of tension that didn't fade easily. She wanted it to be over. She wanted Daniel to say something dismissive, to brush this off and let her retreat into whatever dignity she had left, but he didn't. He didn't even look up. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his suit, a slow and deliberate movement, as if he had already moved on from this moment while she was still drowning in it. And then, just as the silence stretched long enough to suffocate, he spoke. "We don't fire people for mistakes," he said simply, his tone even, controlled with no hint of anger. "We see if they can change." Emma's breath hitched. That was it. No long-winded speech, no demand for an explanation, no drawn-out humiliation, just that. But somehow it hit harder than anything else he could have said. Because it wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge. A few passengers exchanged glances, the meaning of his words sinking in, a few heads nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Others remained still, absorbing what had just happened, processing the shift in power, the sudden change in perspective. Emma swallowed hard, her hands still clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to ask what he meant, if that was supposed to be some kind of mercy, some kind of second chance, or if it was just another way to remind her of how badly she had misjudged him. But she couldn't bring herself to speak. The moment lingered just long enough to feel unbearable before the captain's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into JFK. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Emma barely registered the words. The descent had already started, but for her, it felt like she was still falling. The wheels touched down with a smooth but decisive thud, the force of the landing barely registering against the weight in Emma's chest. The usual routine should have followed, passengers stretching, reaching for their bags, unbuckling their seatbelts before the plane even came to a full stop. But none of that happened. No one moved. No one dared. The tension that had gripped first class for the past hour still lingered, thick and suffocating. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for a brief moment as we handle a crew matter before deplaning." Emma's stomach dropped. Passengers exchanged glances. Some looked toward the front of the cabin, toward the flight attendants, toward her. Others kept their heads down, eyes glued to their laps or their phone screens, pretending they weren't witnessing something significant. She forced herself to turn, to look past the rows of seats toward the jet bridge visible through the small window near the front. Her breath caught when she saw them. 2 uniformed airport security officers stood just beyond the glass, their postures straight, unreadable, waiting. Waiting for her. Her pulse pounded so loudly she swore the entire plane could hear it. She had spent years ensuring order in her cabin, making sure everything was controlled, seamless, that passengers respected authority, and now she was the one they were waiting for. The one being escorted off the plane like a liability, a problem to be handled. A movement caught her eye. Daniel Brooks still sat in his seat, completely composed, his expression neutral, as if none of this concerned him at all. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't demanded her removal. He had simply waited, and now everything was unfolding exactly as he had expected. Emma gripped the edge of a nearby seat, her knuckles white. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. The cabin door swung open and the 2 security officers stepped inside. They didn't move aggressively, didn't grab her or demand she come with them. They didn't have to. The message was clear. They were here for her. Emma forced herself to breathe, to stay composed, to not let the heat rising to her face betray the humiliation coursing through her veins. She could feel the weight of every passenger's stare pressing into her back, a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and quiet judgment. The first-class cabin, her domain for so many years, had become a courtroom, and she was standing trial in front of an audience that had already made up their minds. One of the security officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, gave her a nod. "Ma'am, please come with us." Emma's throat tightened. There was no good way out of this, no way to reclaim authority, to salvage whatever was left of her reputation. She felt the urge to turn, to meet Daniel Brooks' gaze one last time, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had already given him enough satisfaction, enough power over this moment. Instead, she squared her shoulders, smoothed down the fabric of her uniform, and took a step forward. The walk through the aisle was worse than she imagined. The whispers were louder now, no longer just hushed speculation, but full conversations happening behind hands and shaking heads. A few passengers stole glances at her with something close to pity, while others didn't bother hiding their quiet satisfaction. Ethan Wallace kept his eyes locked on his phone, pretending none of this was happening, but his posture had changed. He was stiff now, his earlier arrogance gone, as if afraid to be caught in the same storm that had just consumed her. The younger flight attendant, Sophia, stood near the galley watching as Emma passed. There was no smirk, no look of superiority, just something close to sadness, maybe even regret. Emma stepped onto the jet bridge, her breath shallow as the doors sealed behind her, cutting off the murmurs of the cabin. The air outside felt different, colder, heavier, but there was no relief, just the unshakable certainty that this was far from over. A man in a sleek, dark suit stood waiting at the end of the bridge, a tablet in his hand, his expression unreadable. She recognized him immediately, Marcus Hale, a senior operations manager for the airline. She had seen him in briefings before, but only from a distance, the kind of executive you only dealt with when something had gone terribly wrong. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice clipped, professional. "Come with me." She followed in silence, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe this was just protocol. Maybe they'd give her a formal warning, let her issue another apology, move on. Maybe... They entered a private conference room, small, sterile, with nothing but a long table and a few chairs. The walls were blank, devoid of any warmth, any comfort. Marcus sat first, placing his tablet on the table in front of him. He didn't tell her to sit. She did anyway, her fingers gripping her lap beneath the table to keep them from shaking. He exhaled, glancing down at the screen before looking up at her with an expression that sent ice through her veins. "You understand why you're here?" It wasn't a question. Emma swallowed hard. She hesitated, searching for the right words, for something that wouldn't make this worse. "I made a mistake." Marcus studied her, his face unreadable. Then he turned the tablet toward her. She didn't want to look, but she did. It was a passenger complaint report, multiple reports, some from the flight crew, some from passengers. Every single one detailing exactly what had happened in first class. Her stomach turned to stone. "I want to be clear," Marcus said, his tone measured but firm. "This isn't just about what happened today. This is about what it represents." Emma blinked, confused. "I don't understand." Marcus leaned back slightly. "Miss Carter, do you know how many complaints we've received over the years regarding flight attendants making assumptions about passengers who don't look the part?" Her throat went dry. "This isn't new," he continued, his voice even, controlled. "It happens all the time, and usually it doesn't escalate the way it did today. Usually, the passenger doesn't own the airline." She flinched. "But this time it did." He tapped the tablet. "This time you singled out the wrong person." Emma's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I wasn't trying to—" "I don't care what you were trying to do," Marcus cut in sharply, his voice dropping just enough to make her stomach twist. "I care about what you did." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then Marcus exhaled, tapping something on his screen. I'm going to give you a choice. Emma stiffened. You can resign, he said, his voice unreadable. Quietly. No formal termination, no black mark on your record. You walk away, find another airline, start fresh. No one in this company will stop you. Emma felt her chest tighten. Or, he continued, his gaze pinning her in place, you agree to undergo 6 months of intensive bias training, full diversity and inclusion courses, public service work. And after that, you'll be evaluated. If you pass, you may be reinstated, but there are no guarantees. Emma stared at him, stunned into silence. Bias training. Public service. The idea sent a fresh wave of humiliation through her. 6 months of being studied, watched, forced to sit through lectures on things she had never questioned before. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. You think this is excessive? Emma clenched her jaw, but didn't answer. He tilted his head. Do you know what Mr. Brooke could have done? She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet his gaze. He could have fired you on the spot. He could have sent a company-wide memo making an example out of you. He could have gone to the press, let the entire world see exactly what happened on that plane. Marcus tapped the tablet. Instead, he chose this. Emma swallowed. Daniel Brooks had chosen this. She had expected punishment, expected to be humiliated, but she hadn't expected mercy. The room was deathly silent. Marcus tapped the tablet again, turning it back toward himself. You have until the end of the day to decide. Emma barely managed a nod. But deep down, she already knew. There was no real choice. Emma sat frozen in her chair long after Marcus had finished speaking, her pulse pounding in her ears. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. She had walked into this meeting expecting a verdict, but she hadn't expected this. A mirror held up to her actions, forcing her to see herself clearly for the first time. This wasn't just about Daniel Brooks. This wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. A pattern she had never questioned before. The memory of the other complaints flashed through her mind, the reports Marcus had shown her. Different flights, different passengers, different circumstances, but the same underlying thread. How many times had she assumed? How many times had she dismissed the uncomfortable feeling in her gut, convinced herself she was just following the rules? How many passengers had walked off her planes with that same quiet frustration, that same unspoken knowledge that they had been judged before they even opened their mouths? Her breath hitched as realization hit her like a freight train. She had always seen herself as fair, as professional, as someone who upheld the standards of her airline. But had she ever truly questioned who those standards had been built for? Who they excluded? Who they harmed? Her fingers dug into her lap, nails pressing into her skin as the room around her blurred. She wasn't just facing the consequences of one bad decision, she was facing the truth of who she had been. And it sickened her. A knock at the door jolted her back to the present. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. He simply glanced at the entrance, as if he had been expecting it. The door swung open, and standing there, calm and composed as ever, was Daniel Brooks. Emma stiffened, her body going rigid, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. Daniel stepped inside, nodding slightly to Marcus before settling into the chair across from her. He didn't speak. He didn't lean forward or try to make a dramatic statement. He simply sat there, watching. And that was somehow worse. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no smugness, no sense of victory. Just quiet patience, like a man who had seen this all before, who knew exactly how it would unfold and was just waiting for her to catch up. Emma swallowed hard, the silence stretching unbearably between them. Finally, Daniel tilted his head slightly, his voice as calm as it had been in first class. What are you going to do? The question settled over her like a final weight. There was no lecture, no demand, just that. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached for the document Marcus had left in front of her. She picked up the pen, staring at the words. 6 months of training. 6 months of facing this. 6 months of undoing everything she thought she knew. She pressed the pen to paper and signed. Emma sat stiffly in the conference room, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the presentation screen at the front. The air smelled of stale coffee and dry erase markers, the kind of sterile environment designed to make people focus. But all she could focus on was how badly she wanted to be anywhere else. The training center was modern but simple, with a long rectangular table surrounded by a dozen other employees, each wearing the same forced neutrality on their faces. Some were here voluntarily, others, like her, had been given no choice. A few shuffled awkwardly in their seats, others avoided eye contact, their arms crossed in silent resistance. Emma wasn't sure which group she belonged to yet. A woman in a crisp navy suit stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding yet composed. Her name tag read Lena Hart, but Emma barely processed it as the session began. "Let's start with a question," Lena said, clicking a button on her remote. The projector screen behind her shifted to display a single sentence in bold, black letters. "How many of you have ever assumed something about someone before speaking to them?" A pause. No one moved at first. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Emma hesitated, her fingers twitching in her lap. The room was silent except for the quiet rustling of fabric as more people lifted their hands. Some seemed reluctant, others more sure of themselves. Emma exhaled through her nose and, with a tightness in her chest, raised her own hand. Lena's gaze swept the room, unfazed. "That's what I thought," she said. "Now, let's talk about why." Emma stared at the words on the screen, her throat tightening. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in just a little closer, the weight of the question suffocating in its simplicity. How many of you have ever assumed someone didn't belong without even realizing it? It wasn't just a question, it was a mirror. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was thick, the kind that stretched long enough to make people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Emma could feel the tension, the hesitation, the invisible battle playing out inside everyone's heads. No one wanted to be the first to admit it. But the truth was, they all had. Her fingers twitched in her lap. She had already raised her hand for the first question, and that had been hard enough, but this was something else entirely. Lena Hart, the instructor, stood at the front, her arms crossed casually as she waited. She wasn't rushing them, she wasn't pressuring them, she just stood there, watching, giving them space to confront something most of them had probably never had to think about before. Emma's heartbeat thudded in her ears. She thought about Daniel Brooks sitting in first class, the way she had approached him with certainty, the way she had barely glanced at his ticket before deciding it wasn't right, the way she had dismissed his calm demeanor as defiance rather than quiet patience. She thought about the other complaints, the ones Marcus had shown her, the passengers she had questioned, the ones who had felt the exact same judgment she had placed on Daniel, only they hadn't owned the airline, so no one had ever forced her to acknowledge it. Emma exhaled slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, she lifted her hand. It wasn't confident, it wasn't bold, it was small, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. Across the table, someone else raised their hand, then another. A woman near the back lifted hers, her expression guarded, like she was bracing herself for the weight of the admission. One by one, more hands went up, each movement hesitant but deliberate. Lena nodded as if she had expected this. "And that," she said, her voice steady, "is why we're here." Emma let her hand drop back into her lap, her fingers curling into a fist. She had spent so much of her career convinced she was good at her job, that she was fair, that she followed the rules the way they were meant to be followed. But what if she had been wrong? What if she had been so sure of her own authority that she had never stopped to question whether that authority was ever misplaced? The thought made her stomach twist. Lena clicked the remote and the screen changed again. This time it displayed two images side by side, one of a well-dressed businessman in a suit, the other of a man in casual clothes, his hoodie pulled up over his head. "Now," Lena said, tilting her head slightly, "let's talk about what we see before we even say a word." Emma sat in her car outside the training center, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot, but she hadn't started the engine. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. For the past 6 months, she had spent every session peeling back layers of herself she hadn't even realized were there. She had walked into that room thinking she was being punished, that this was a sentence handed down to humiliate her. But now, sitting in the quiet stillness of her car, she understood something she had never allowed herself to before. I thought I knew how the world worked. She had thought she understood people, that her years of experience had made her a good judge of character, that she could spot trouble before it happened, keep order, keep things running smoothly. I was wrong. She had been so sure of herself when she told Daniel Brooks he was in the wrong seat. She had been so sure when she dismissed the tension in his eyes as defiance instead of patience. She had been so sure when she let Ethan Wallace's words go unchecked, when she assumed she was simply enforcing the rules instead of reinforcing something much uglier. But the truth was, she had never questioned what she had been enforcing, never questioned who those unspoken rules served. She inhaled shakily, her fingers tightening on the wheel before she finally reached for her phone. There was one thing left to do. She scrolled through her contacts until she found his name, Daniel Brooks. She hesitated, then typed 2 simple words. "Thank you." She stared at the screen for a long time before pressing send. Maybe he would reply, maybe he wouldn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was, for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from what she had done. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't trying to defend herself. She was just acknowledging the truth. Her chest felt lighter as she set the phone down, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. But this wasn't the end. This wasn't about one mistake. It wasn't about one flight. It wasn't about one man being asked to move from his seat. It was about the quiet, insidious ways assumptions shaped the world, the moments that passed unnoticed, the judgments that went unchallenged, the doors that quietly shut before some people ever had a chance to walk through them. And so now, the challenge wasn't just for her, it was for everyone. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Or have you made a snap judgment about someone else? Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silent assumptions. The question is, what will you do when faced with the truth? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. Because change doesn't happen in grand gestures, it happens in the small moments, the quiet choices, the times when we decide to challenge what we've always accepted. It happens when we choose to listen, to learn, to see. And most importantly, it happens when we refuse to look away.